I'm with Ted Shapas, a member of the San Ramon Valley Genealogical Society, and I'd like to ask him about his family history. What first got you interested in your family history?
Well, that's a good question. The timing was probably in the late 90s, and I had received some photographs from an uncle who had just passed away, and they were very intriguing. They were photos of my grandfather. I also had a very nice scrapbook of photos that my father had taken, and for the life of me, I couldn't identify as many as I would have liked. So I got very interested in trying to understand who these people were, which led to the really big question of, gee, where did I come from?
So did you feel as if you were in a race against time? Were you already too late? What triggered this?
Well, I think most of us who jump into this genealogy, family history operation are a little bit too late, in that a lot of the people who we would have liked to have asked questions to have already passed away. And had I started this in my 20s, it would have been great. But as it were, I was in my 60s, and you can only do the best you can. However, it also dawned on me that I actually knew a lot of the connections and stories, and it would be a good idea for me to write them down so that my ancestors could understand them as well.
So when you talk about stories, can you flesh out some of the dates? Some of what you knew.
Well, I knew that my grandfather had gotten married in Chicago in 1912, and I had a wedding record of that, and I had a photograph of them, he and his wife, at the wedding. So I had that as kind of a benchmark, but going back in time prior to that, it was all a bunch of guesswork. So I was really interested in understanding how they got here, and even more interesting, if I could learn where they came from in Eastern Europe, that would be absolutely great.
So, particularly Eastern Europe, there's a language barrier. Did you just go at this cold, or did you have people helping you?
Well, that's a great question. My ancestors were from Lithuania on my one grandfather's side, so there was a pretty big language barrier. I contacted the Balzikas Museum in Chicago, and they were a great help in leading me towards areas of Lithuania where my last name was actually somewhat prevalent. I had some good luck then from the internet, in that all of a sudden the entire Lithuanian phone book appeared online with addresses and phone numbers, and I was able to look through that phone book and find my last name. There were about 20 people, as I recall, and I wrote them all letters, actually in Lithuanian, and the Balzikas Museum helped me with that as well. And in a few weeks, I got answers back from about 10 of those people, which was amazing and outstanding.
So you mentioned a very important feature of the internet helping your research. Can you describe a bit about how it was then versus how it is now?
Sure. In today's realm of genealogy searching, it is very easy and inexpensive to find the sort of documents and information you are seeking, compared with even 20 years ago, when it was most difficult and expensive and usually required traveling around the country or around the world to visit archives or museums. A lot of this is now online through public sources, through subscription sources, and right from the fingertips of your keyboard, you can find all kinds of information about your family history.
So, can you give some indication of cost? Like people who say, well, I don't have enough money to get involved with this hobby.
Yeah, sure. It's actually a pretty inexpensive hobby. It turns out it's the second most popular hobby in the U.S. these days, right behind gardening. It can be done very, very inexpensively. There are a number of databases. One is called Family Search that is absolutely free and has unbelievable amounts of information available through searching. It has a lot of historical information about countries of origin and so on. And it also has helpers that you can contact who will aid in your searching and answer questions for you. Also, the LDS Church has what are known as family history centers scattered all across the country. And these are usually associated with their churches. They are open to the public and absolutely free, and are resource centers for genealogy and family history research for anybody who lives near them. You don't have to be a member of the church, and you can visit them at your convenience and whenever they are open, and do some research right there. And again, that's free. Plus, many of the public libraries these days have access to some of these databases, and you can do genealogy research and searching from there for free as well.
So if someone says, you're just interested in collecting dead relatives, you just compile dates, it's like stamp collecting, it's really boring. What can you say about family history from all this research?
Well, I think the basics revolve around what is known as genealogy, and that is collecting those sorts of fairly dry pieces of information: birth, death, marriage records, and so on. And if that's all you do, that could be absolutely fine. Most people would not be real interested in reading about that because it is fairly boring. Unless you are the feature in that sort of information stream. However, the next horizon above genealogy, I think, is called family history. And that brings in the stories and the anecdotes and the travails of your family as they moved around. It brings in narratives that you really can't capture in just looking at births and deaths and censuses. So for many people who are jumping into this, they will eventually get involved in some sort of family history, recording, documentation, and maybe even book writing.
So for an average person who's not related to George Washington, who doesn't have any Mayflower ancestry, no kudos, really, what can it give me?
Well, I think it goes back again to a detective story. It satisfies your curiosity around who you are and how you got here. I think for many of us, how you arrived in the U.S. as an immigrant family is fascinating personal history that is fun to discover, it's fun to understand. You might find out that your parents came through Ellis Island. You might find out that you had train robbers in your family. You never know where this is going to lead, and that's what makes family history studies so absolutely interesting.
So now there's a big craze about linking genealogy with DNA studies. You know, spit in a tube, and you can basically leap back a few hundred years and discover ancestors you don't know you had. Can you share a bit about your experience?
Sure. DNA has added another element to genealogy research. Instead of just census records and probate records and so on, now you have this genetic DNA fingerprint that describes you and also helps describe relatives who are near you and are related to you. Sometimes relatives you didn't know existed, and relatives that may be in far off places. So it's added another element to understanding your family and what it's composed of, where they are scattered around the globe, perhaps, and it helps you understand where you came from.
So again, on these commercials, it shows people going to exotic places and meeting exotic people and saying hello and shaking hands, smiling. Do you have any experience going to any place exotic?
Well, I don't know if it's exotic, but after researching my Lithuanian family for a while, I was able to contact a distant cousin who was an archaeologist in Lithuania, and she helped me create a family tree through the Lithuanian archives. The archives in Lithuania compiled all of the census and birth and death records from Lithuanian churches going back as far as the 1600s. Of course, it's all in Lithuanian or Russian or Polish or Latin, and I couldn't read any of it. But she helped me get through it, and they were able to produce a fabulous family tree for us. The next step was that my wife and I decided we would take a trip to Lithuania and see what this place was all about. And so we hooked up with a tour group, mainly consisting of Lithuanians who wanted to go back and visit a place they had once lived in. Of course, for me, I was several generations removed, so it was all brand new to me. But we traveled around the country for a couple of weeks, visited a lot of the historical sites, and had a great time. After that, we rented a car, went to visit my cousin, which was a fabulous experience. She took us to some archaeological sites. One was a hill fort that was being excavated, and she knew the archaeologist who was working at the time there. He took us and showed us what he had found that day, and we were able to handle some artifacts from maybe the 11 or 1200s that related to a time when this fort was occupied and also burned down by the Teutonic Knights. Fabulous history involved. She then took us out to the countryside, and we knocked on some doors, and amazingly we were able to find some of my relatives still living and farming in this tiny little village that I had identified earlier through other genealogy work. And they were as excited to see us there as we were to find them. So it was quite an amazing experience. I was able to walk through farmland that my grandfather had walked through. I ate an apple from a tree that he had probably eaten an apple from as well. So it was a fabulous trip, and I encourage anybody who gets involved in genealogy, especially if it involves some sort of link to the old country in Europe or elsewhere, to make an effort to go back and visit their homelands.
So far, you've described for us your journey, basically getting involved with family history, following through, being a computer nerd, extracting as much as you can from online sources. That finally leads us to, why should I join a genealogical society and talk to real people?
Sure. It's easy to find a lot of information right from the confines of your computer and keyboard these days. However, you usually get stuck in some sort of question about something, and it's hard to get those questions answered without interacting with a real live person. And that's where I find these societies to be very, very important. Our local San Ramon Valley Genealogical Society has a great array of people experience with all kinds of backgrounds and family histories and genealogy tools. We have speakers on various subjects. A meeting does not go by that I don't learn something that I had no idea about before, and it's usually useful information for my own research. So I encourage people to get involved in their local genealogical society and work with the folks there to become a better family historian.
Thank you very much. I think you've really covered a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.